Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. This episode was recorded in late November of 2025. Well, for the first time, the head of CSIS, Dan Rogers, addressed the public about national security concerns in November of last year. And he gave a stat that shocked a lot of people. He said that nearly 1 in 10 terrorism investigations in Canada involves at least one minor under the age of 18. Since 2014, there have been 20 violent extremist attacks in Canada, resulting in 29 deaths. He also touched on Chinese and Russian interference and the weaponization of Canadian data and information. He said the demands on CSIS have been unrelenting, but that his intent was not to alarm, but to reassure the public that CSIS was, quote, working tirelessly in their best interests, unquote. Stephanie Carvin is an associate professor of international relations at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and I am eager to get her take on national security in Canada, what we know, what we don't know, and what we need to be doing. Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So, I just want to start off with Dan Rogers. He went on, gave some alarming statistics, and then he ends up saying, well, I don't want to alarm people with this speech. Do you think we were alarmed?
It was interesting to see just the sheer variety of headlines that came out of that speech. And I'm sure the comms people at Service were very, very pleased with the outcome of that, right? It generated a lot of the headlines. Yeah. We're a really big, lucky country. We haven't really had to think about national security in a lot of ways. We have been bordered by the United States, which is usually pretty normal. Like we're going through some things right now, let's be honest. But, in 3 oceans, we don't have to really worry about being invaded. We don't really have to worry about a lot of the other problems. When you go to other countries in the Indo-Pacific or the Middle East, they live in different neighborhoods. They look at the world differently. And we've had this incredible blessing of geography. And I think what this means is that we don't think about national security. And I do believe that's a good thing. Even as someone who studies this for a living, I would like us to think about it a little bit more. But that being said, I think what the Service is trying to do is just remind Canadians of that, A, they exist, B, that, the challenges are mounting and that this is what they're dealing with. So it was an important transparency exercise, but in a lot of ways, it was also kind of a PR exercise to remind Canadians of what's out there and some of the concerns that Canada and the different national security agencies are dealing with.
Yeah, Christmas is over, Stephanie. It's the new year now.
Yes, it's a lot. That was effectively a bit of a Christmas list of scary things.
Yeah, you know what? So it's interesting because I went back to your book that you wrote in the height of the pandemic, right? Or it was released anyway in the height of the pandemic in 2021, Stand on Guard. And I found so much, of course, is still relevant today. And you said in the book that Canada finds itself in the most complex threat environment since the Second World War. Why is that?
So it's funny. Yeah, that was, if we think about it, 2026, that was written 5 years ago. And I would actually say in some ways it's gotten worse rather than better. I think I was writing back then because the pandemic really brought together a lot of different things. The way we had to suddenly think about border security rapidly changed. It wasn't so much about, just monitoring people. It was also monitoring shipments and, were people trying to smuggle things into the country as we were desperate to try and get PPE into the country? And how was that forcing different national security agencies like the CBSA to work with, the Health Canada in terms of, assessing what was actually a viable PPE product and what wasn't. And this was a big deal, right? And of course, people being at home out of the pandemic came the so-called Freedom Convoy, right, which wasn't necessarily a group of extremists, but certainly a movement that extremist groups did take advantage of. And then on top of that, there were people working from home who were suddenly their computers are vulnerable and they have their company's valuable data and IP on them. And how can you protect that data? So that's kind of what I was thinking of at the time. Now, a lot of that has changed and moved on. We are still seeing high levels of violent extremism in this country, and we can talk about that after if you want. Certainly, the threat of foreign interference has become a lot more clear since that time. We've had the inquiries. And then on top of that, of course, there's no let up in the interest of foreign actors in terms of engaging in espionage activities. And in some cases like Russia, they may now be actively engaged in sabotage as well. So, in a lot of ways, it's gotten worse. And the international order that we depended on to really protect us and our networks to work with other countries is now also under strain because of changes in the United States. All of this is a long way of saying, it got worse. It seems to have gotten worse.
I absolutely want to go through those points in more detail, but let's start with the first one about violent extremism in Canada. I just want to go back to that stat that Dan Rogers gave about at least 1 in 10 investigations involve a minor. So how much of a concern is that, the fact that they're so young?
It's a huge concern because the instruments of the state, the national security state, were not meant for children, right? I mean, when we're talking about countering terrorists, you're thinking of like people in their 20s, 30s, or older who had tremendous capabilities and were probably educated in some way. And that's not what we're dealing with. Now, to be fair, this is not the first time we have been dealing with minors in these situations. One of the things we saw in, I would say, 2013 through to about 2016, we did see a large number of minors really upset by what they were seeing in Syria and wanting to go over there and actually join in on the fighting because they felt, there was a sense of injustice there and they wanted to address it. And on top of that, so they're on forums on the internet and they were being targeted by, Islamic State, or what the Canadian government calls Daesh, Daesh recruiters who were looking to bring these minors over and convincing them, yes, this is the right thing. This is absolutely, you will live an amazing life over here and your life will be worth something. And so so it's not the first time that we have seen youth engage in this, but the fact is now that it is such a large percentage of the, individuals who are online, the fact that, extremist groups and movements know this, and they are going into platforms like Roblox and other computer games to try and convince young kids to either engage in some kind of violent extremism or some kind of violent act to further their own ends, or in some cases just because they think it's funny and it's great to emotionally torture a minor. So it really is a horrible situation. I mean, I don't want to scare everyone off the internet, but this is the way that we are seeing violent extremism play out in real time. And parents need to be aware of that. Sorry.
Yeah. Can I just clarify something? Because what you were talking about regarding these youths who were interested in going to Syria and being recruited online, does that stat cover both that situation, but also minors who are involved in an event that happens, a terrorism event that happens on Canadian soil?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
So, Oh, yeah. So when I was talking about the Syria situation, that was kind of like about 10 years ago, right? Yeah. So that was kind of the first time I think that the service was really dealing with minors. And one of the review agencies for CSIS, which at that time was called the Security Intelligence Review Committee, CIRC, they actually did a report on this and said, this is, you have to have special policies and procedures in place when you're dealing with a minor, because you don't want to put like the security services of a state against a 12-year-old, right? I mean, it means something. They have parents. There's other options. And can you then like take these children and effectively get them into some kind of mental health program or some kind of, some kind of institution where they are able to kind of maybe work out some of these issues or be convinced that, dedicating their life to violence is maybe not the best idea for them. So, just to be clear, when I saw what Dan said, back in 2025, the end of 2025. I think what was really important is the fact that, I think he wasn't just talking about, Canadians trying to leave the country or youth trying to leave the country. Yeah. He's talking about youth here. And he actually mentioned 3 different attacks, right? He mentioned, disrupted plots in Montreal, in Ottawa, and Edmonton and it's not just one kind of violent extremism. It's from, yes, you are still seeing people inspired by, what we call the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or Daesh kinds of narratives. But on the other hand, you also have individuals who are inspired by what we call ideologically motivated violent extremisms, or extremism that we've traditionally kind of associated with the far right.
It's interesting you bring up Al-Qaeda, because we don't talk about that group very much anymore. It's almost as if, I'm trying to remember now, was it over a decade ago when Osama bin Laden and the top leaders were killed? I think it was over a decade now.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, and then it kind of, I don't know, it seemed to me to sort of go off our radar. Is that not a good thing?
Well,
we don't hear.
Yeah, they're still out there. They definitely haven't gone away. I think one of the issues is that, to a large extent, the Islamic State became the more, I don't want to say trendy, but one of the interesting things that we saw with regards to Al-Qaeda in its development was that it, back in 2001, it was actually very hard to join Al-Qaeda. Like, you had to know a guy who knew a guy. You would be recruited over a number of years. You would be put through training camps and things like that. It becomes very, very hard. It's a very select process. And then, in the mid 2000s, they kind of decide to franchise in a lot of ways. So you had Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You had Al-Qaeda in different parts of, in the Islamic Maghreb, right? In parts of Africa. So you have these kind of franchises that are created. But then the Islamic State comes along, and what they do is they say, if you want to join us, you are welcome. And they lowered the threshold to join a violent extremist movement. So all these people who, regardless of their qualifications, regardless of what they knew or who they knew, they suddenly just had to get themselves to Syria. Right. And that wasn't a hard thing to do. Syria is physically connected to Europe, right? You can actually
through
drive
Turkey,
there.
right? You can go through Turkey and
absolutely, and that's what people were doing, right? So that was the thing. So they lowered that threshold, and I think ever since then, we have started seeing a lot of these it's not so much groups anymore, these hierarchical groups. What we are seeing are kind of diffuse movements, and individuals now. The Islamic State originally encourage people to go to Syria to join. Now, the Islamic State's also now in different parts. It's in Africa, it's in Somalia, it's in Afghanistan as well. And so in some ways, it's kind of taken over from parts of Al-Qaeda and things like that. But what we are seeing now is, for a long time, they wanted people to physically go there. But then when that became much more harder, as states increasingly cracked down on individuals who are inspired to travel, these groups then said, okay, just attack where you are. Right. And then so that's what eventually happened. And so individuals who couldn't travel then were encouraged to do that here. But, as they lost their territory in Syria, they became far less of an issue here for a number of years. The concern is that there's a lot of tensions in the Middle East, of course, and that violent extremist groups are 100% using some of the narratives, some of the injustices that have come out of that conflict to their own ends. And that's, one of the issues that some of the people who are being charged now for violent extremism or wanting to conduct violent extremism attacks, they are effectively, kind of doing so in the name of some of these groups that have been out there, even if they really haven't had a lot of substantial connections to them. They themselves identify with the movement. They've been encouraged to attack where they are, and that's effectively what they're doing.
Yeah. So can we bring that home as to what would be happening here? Because there was a statement I saw, it was released from the G7 security ministers, and they were talking about transnational organized crime groups. That looked like it was at the top of the list. So how much of a concern are transnationals here in Canada?
So what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting with the Trump administration is that you're seeing a real blend of violent extremism and criminality. And I have serious concerns about this. I don't necessarily believe that we should be applying the tools that we use for national security to the kinds of tools we used for crime. Right. And this is absolutely where the Trump administration wants to go. And they have absolutely designated certain groups as engaging in violent extremism, right? And they've designated them effectively as foreign terrorist entities. And there's pressure on Canada to do so as well. Now, let's be honest. Some of these like drug gangs that are out there are absolutely using terrorist-like tactics, right? Like they will take towns hostage. They take hostages just straight up. There's a lot of similarity in the tactics that they use, but that doesn't necessarily mean you want to be using national security legislation or national security powers in order to fight these, organizations. We want to be really careful. There's different motives at stake here. There's different, organizational aspects, and as well, a lot more, what you would call like civilians as well. So I think we want to be really careful with that and how we do it. Now, that being said, there's a third element here, which I think I'm just maybe confusing things further. But so let's I just want to be careful in terms of how we discuss that link to transnational organized crime with violent extremism. I would actually say there's almost more, from a national security perspective, a concern with espionage and foreign interference and transnational organized crime. And we've seen this with the Bushnoi group, which has now been listed as a terrorist entity in Canada. The Bushnoi was basically a violent extremist, well, not a violent extremist, but like a violent criminal gang that India was using in order to harass the Sikh population here in Canada. And, we've heard so much about that in the last 2 years. So one of the things we are seeing is that when states do want to engage in harassment and foreign interference, they are actually turning to criminal gangs to do those kinds of activities. Or in the case of Russia, they're often turning to organized crime in order to fulfill their wish list for items that they need in order to fight wars or to engage in sabotage operations, which we've seen across Europe. And there's also been some reporting on plots that could have been targeting Canada as well. So the organized crime element to this, there are national security links, but I do like to keep those two things separate because national security powers are a lot, right? In a lot of sense, they allow you to make exceptions to normal everyday kind of criminal law and proceedings and things like this. We don't want to just use them for anything. Right? We want to be really, really careful. We don't want to turn everything into a terrorist threat. And I do worry that this is maybe one of the trends we saw over 2025 because some of the pressures of the Trump administration.
So let me ask you then, like right now in Canada, what group or groups would you say are the biggest threat to security?
To me, it's interesting. You didn't hear Dan Rogers, the director of CSIS, name too many groups, right? Did you?
No.
And
wasn't that one of your criticisms? You said that he kind of glossed over, didn't really get into espionage and foreign interference.
Well, espionage and foreign interference. Oh, do you want to talk about violent extremism or espionage and foreign interference?
We can sorry, I mean in his report, he didn't. He didn't really go there.
He didn't go there with violent extremism. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, with the espionage and foreign interference. Actually, if anything, what really surprised me is earlier this year in the CSIS's public report. So you can actually go on the CSIS website and read their public report, which came out in the spring of 2025. And what they said was that terrorism is now the priority threat, which was interesting because ever since I would say about 2018, the service has effectively said that espionage and foreign interference are the priority national security threats to Canada and that violent extremism is important, but we now consider it to be a public safety risk.
Yeah. That so language, why? Yeah. Why? How do you read that? How do you read that?
Yeah. So, and looking at that, that's to me is a big shift, right? Like in language, and it might not be to maybe, I don't want to say the average Canadian, like make myself sound special, but like as someone who, has experience writing these kinds of documents and reading them, when I look at that, to me, it says that there has been a surge in activity in the violent extremist space. And that's where the service is now having to put the majority of its resources. Away from the espionage and foreign interference file. Now we shouldn't read too much into that. It's not like they were giving up one or the other, but that is a serious change in the posture, right? For a long time, the service is effectively saying, violent extremism is mostly a police issue, and really the RCMP should be dealing with it, to the point now where it kind of is coming out as the screaming headline of both the public report in 2025 as well as Dan Rogers' 2025 speech. And that to me is interesting. Now, again, that doesn't mean that these threats have gone away. It just means that the service has limited resources, and that's where it is effectively putting those resources.
So is that take that you're giving us, kind of giving him the benefit of doubt? Because I also wonder, the timing of that speech was when we were engaged in trade negotiations with China and India. And I'm not sure whether that had anything to do with it. And he didn't want to make too much of a fuss about foreign interference when that's going on. I don't know. How much does Carney have to do with this report?
Well, it's interesting. In theory, the service writes its own reports, right? Like it is, it is looking at the intelligence that it's collecting, and then based on how it's allocating its resources, it reports to Canadians effectively on how it views the world and the world threats. And I think that's important. You're right. We have had a shift under the Carney government towards more friendly relations with some of the countries that were seen as priority threats under the Trudeau government, including China and India. Now, I think that the service has to be honest. I don't think it can lie to Canadians about what.
No, but it doesn't have to lie, but it could maybe not say something.
I might not say something. I think one of the things to remember is that while the service goes out and collects information, it does so at the request of government. So the government puts out something called intelligence requirements. And the intelligence requirements are basically a survey of like, what are the top threats to Canada? And what do you want, what it wants the service to collect information on. So it might be like, People's Republic of China espionage activities, People's Republic of China foreign interference activities, People's Republic of China connections to organized criminality and all those kinds of things. So those are the kinds of like lists of things that you would do. And you do the same for Russia, for India, and then you'd have one for violent extremism. And all of those categories are given a number, right? So is it as tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? And then so the service collects that information according to the wish list of what the government says it needs in order to make decisions. Mm-hmm. So it's like, yes, it is kind of an independent process, but it's one that's also guided, right? And so the service is, its job in the you can look at the CSIS Act. The CSIS Act says that it's supposed to, collect information and advise the government of Canada accordingly. So the government of Canada has to say what it wants to be advised on. But at the same time, obviously, if there's a crisis brewing and things like that, the service is going to collect information on that. So I don't think that there is a politicization here in terms of what's out there. I think that I'm surprised to see the service come out and list violent extremism as that kind of priority threat. I don't think that decision is made lightly. But it also, because I do think the service is increasingly thinking about kind of over the horizon threats and things that may be coming at Canada, especially in this world where we may not be able to rely on the United States as we have before. So I do take the service director at his word when he says that, yes, this is actually the way we see it right now. But again, I don't want Canadians to walk away and just because something is a priority today doesn't mean something else is going to be isn't going to be a priority next week. These things change so fast. And to get back to your first question about why this environment is so complex, and the complexity is due to the fluidity. Analysts love this word. We always say fluid. The things are fluid. Things change, things move. They're fluid. It's a bit of a get out of jail card. Yeah. It's like, why do you warn us about this? Well, it's very fluid, right? So, I think this is something that we have to be aware of, is that there is that kind of fluidity that goes with that. And, what is listed as a priority threat this year may change next year, depending on what happens, in 2026, 2027 and onwards. But
and even in your book, you still have big concerns. Okay, sure, not to dismiss violent extremism, but with espionage, foreign interference. What are your top concerns there?
So with espionage, to a large extent, it is not necessarily I think a lot of people think that, China's trying to break into the vault of Canadian secrets somewhere that,
well, we have examples.
Yes,
we do have examples.
Oh, absolutely. We have examples. And yes, they are trying to hack the government at all times. The thing I actually worry about is the hacking of research institutions, of law firms, of, maybe we don't think about, but law firms hold tremendous amounts of very valuable data and intentions, private companies and their intellectual property. These are the targets that, in some cases, I would say the priority targets. And, even during the pandemic, when, I was kind of finishing up the book, Five Eyes agencies were actively warning different institutions. They're like, look, like they're, especially institutions in private companies involved in medical research. They said, look, like adversarial governments are coming for your intellectual property if you're not careful. Like, are you actually securing this? And this was a really important statement. I think it wasn't so much the service, it was our signals intelligence agency or our communication security establishment. They're kind of the cyber spies. I think the technical term, it's Canada's National Cryptologic Agency. But by and large, they're the ones who are, surfing the web and trying to collect information that it pertains to threats to the government of Canada. But all that to be said, with regards to how this works is, espionage during the Cold War was a lot of times trying to get secrets from governments and government plans and things like that. And today it really is aimed at the private sector, universities, things like that. That is a major change. And the other thing is too, is like a lot of these private companies, well, they are increasingly hardened and taking security more seriously, but it's taken a while for us to get there and have those conversations with the private sector and say, hey, that person you met on the business trip might not actually be who you think it is. And, that partner who's interested in working with you, do you really know who they are? And your cyber, do you have the proper security protocols in place? All these things have taken a while to have those conversations, but I think they're starting to take place a lot more now.
I am so glad you brought this up because you're absolutely right. I think if you just said espionage to the public, they think about government, state secrets, right? How foreign actors or foreign governments try to get that. But then this is like economic espionage,
absolutely.
Right? They're targeting and sometimes a huge, powerful private company, that can affect that sector. The thing is though, how would we necessarily know? I mean, these are private companies. Do they really want that getting out? They've got stock. They've got shareholders. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how much do we really?
100%.
Yeah. So how much do we really know about what's going on in that whole area?
You're right. There is a lack of trust there, I think, sometimes because for that reason that, once it gets out that, company ABC got hacked. I mean, their stock market value is going to completely plunge, right? So they want to be careful. What we are seeing now, though, is attempts in legislation to compel companies to notify the government if they have been hacked. So if you are a company in the areas of finance, transportation, telecommunication, or energy, there's legislation, Bill C-8, which, is kind of working its way through Parliament and is going to compel you to report to the government. I believe if you've been hacked, you have to let the government know in 72 hours. Now, a lot of people in government are very unhappy, I should say a lot of people in the private sector are unhappy about this. They feel, 72 hours isn't long enough to know, or figure out what happened. The government's attitude is, well, look, if you've been hit in some way in 72 hours and you can let us know that. So that way the government could actually decide perhaps to step in, take measures, those kinds of things. So that's one of the things that the government is doing to try and improve communications, but a lot of critics would say it's doing it in a way that is too ham-fisted, putting too many requirements on those sectors, like banks, and they don't really like it. So is that the best way to have these conversations? I don't know, but it is definitely, at least the government feels that it needs now to have that legislative authority to compel those companies to do this kind of stuff.
What's the biggest hack that we know of?
That's a great question. I think it depends on what you mean by hack. If you think about like in Canada, I don't know. I would say in some ways, I wonder if it's the Desjardins But that wasn't so much a hack. That was an insider threat,
Well,
right? That was a grumpy employee.
I mean, this is a really old one, but I think it was, I mean, it just shook everyone up, was the alleged one that happened at Nortel that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, it's
That's
never been
really
proven.
No, I know. That's why I said alleged. I said alleged.
It is alleged. Yeah, the idea that China had stolen all of Nortel's intellectual property. Other people have told me, Nortel management made some pretty bad decisions. That was effectively the death knell. But to the point, whether or not it's true, that scenario is the thing we worry about the most.
Yeah.
The fact that, these hacks have happened, that their IP is stolen and then is put into technology in foreign companies, and then is kind of marketed back against us, and the Canadian companies go bust as a result. There's a lot of accusations that China did this to solar panel companies, especially in the United States and probably here in Canada as well. They stole a ton of intellectual property regarding these green technologies. They were then able to manufacture, some of the best green technologies in the world and now dominate that industry, effectively putting the North American solar panel industry in a lot of distress. And that's a bad outcome, right, for Canada in terms of manufacturing. And it's not good if one country controls such a vital element of the energy transition, right? You want multiple, you want multiple options. You want redundancy in the system. China absolutely does not want that to happen. And so, and will use its cyber powers to ensure it doesn't.
See, what I find though, disturbing is, I mean, it's one thing if things are done illegally, where a system is hacked and China, let's say, gets in there. But when it's all legal, so meaning China makes an agreement with a company that they want access to their technology, that's all above board. So meanwhile, that company has to hand over, right? Because they've made an agreement, a contract. That's happened.
Right, exactly. And that was one of the strategies that they've effectively used for a long time, right? So, they're like, okay, well, we won't steal the information. We'll just buy it. Yeah. And they see, they're like, okay, we paid $10 billion for this company, but we think the IP is worth $3 trillion or something like that, right? And so that is something that China has done. Now, we do have a way to counter that, which is, I don't know how nerdy we want to get on the podcast, but we do have something called the Investment Canada Act. And now anytime a foreign company wants to take over a Canadian company, it goes through, it may be required to go through a national security review. And the government can effectively say, nope, this is too strategic, or we don't like this, or, there's a negative outcome here that we don't like. And we are going to force, we're going to ban the investment, or we're going to require something called the divestiture, which is effectively telling the country to sell it. You're not allowed. You're not welcome here anymore. And that applies to any company. So that kind of has any kind of Canadian connection. So it's like there was a Canadian mine in Argentina, and I think that they were going to sell it to China. And I think the government can come in and effectively, if it wants, can effectively come in and just say, no, we don't like that. You're a Canadian company. You have to abide by this. So actually that's a really powerful piece of legislation. I think most Canadians, again, they're thinking of spy versus spy. They're thinking James Bond jumping out of a helicopter. But the way, this kind of counterintelligence, counterespionage is done is often through the, something called the Investment Canada Act, which, sounds very kind of positive and things like that, but is actually our most important national security tool in terms of protecting our economic prosperity.
As far as countries go, like who would be the biggest threat? Is it China? Is it Russia?
By most accounts, yeah. I mean, it depends what the issue is specifically. Like, if you're saying violent extremism, well, it's not China. If it's really not a country. You're talking about like movements that are, exist primarily now online. But with China, it is from that, just because of its capacity. Right. It has a large number of people, large capacity, large security state, and it puts it to ends that,
well, and also,
we don't like.
Yeah. I just think of like, what's the evidence? And if I think about the history of China's interference here, I mean, they've done everything from bans, boycotts. They have targeted Canadian citizens both here on our soil and in China. They have tampered in our elections. Those are just a few. They've tried. They have tried to tamper. Yes. Sorry about that again. Yes.
Fair enough.
But do you know what? Like the scope and the history of this, it's
very large.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is, there's a large Chinese population in Canada. I want to be careful here because we have in recent years seen a surge of racist attacks on, Asian Canadians.
Yes.
And so I want to be very, very careful in terms of how we talk about this. But there is a large community here that is of interest to China. China wants our resources. China sees us potentially as an asset in our kind of competition with the United States, right? So for all these reasons, I do think that, yes, that Canada is and remains a target of China, but that doesn't mean bizarrely, that means in some ways we still have to deal with them, right?
Yeah,
we have to kind of explain to them like, okay, no, you can't do that, or, trying to come to some kind of agreement with China. But this is really difficult. And I think China, to a certain extent, senses that we are in a position right now with the United States that
I didn't mention the Arctic either. I didn't even mention the Arctic.
Yes.
There's the Arctic. No, and also because you brought up Chinese citizens here, what about that diaspora? They've also been targeted.
Absolutely, they've been targeted, right?
Yeah.
And, they have to be careful with what they say on social media. They have to be careful with expressing their views. I'll be honest with you. I have teaching assistants at Carleton, and they've come up to me. And so these are graduate students who are doing a lot of the seminars with undergraduates. And they have had Chinese students come up to them saying, I can't speak in class because I feel like I'm being monitored and I can't, and I'm worried that this is affecting my participation grade. And that I've heard that from my TAs more than once. Now, I don't know, I'll take those students at their word that they're concerned. I mean, maybe they just don't want to participate in class. It's possible. But that being said, I mean, this is a real thing that people do feel that they are being monitored. And that's a real problem. Now, at the same time, we have to be clear that, maybe you believe that Canada and China should have better ties. That's perfectly okay. You are allowed to believe that. That is your right. And it's okay so long as you're expressing that in a democratic way. The concern with China is that they're trying to amplify narratives that it likes and then find ways to suppress those that it does not like. And it certainly has control over its social media platforms. We think of WeChat, but, to a certain extent, we have to worry about things like TikTok, which is also Chinese owned. But, we have to recognize that, there are people, but it's very hard, right? In some sense, you have a situation where individuals are reporting harassment, but that harassment's coming from overseas, which means it's very hard for Canadian officials to really put a stop to it. Or if, someone's being threatened here in Canada that their family overseas is going to be targeted because of things that they're saying, there's not a heck of a lot that Canadian officials can do about it. I mean, you could probably bring it up and say, we don't like this, but it's a very difficult thing for us to really deal with. And it's going to be, I think, an ongoing, even though we don't really talk about foreign interference the way that we really used to, it is something that is probably going to be ongoing from China for the foreseeable future. Yeah. So how, and it's not really, we are taking steps with the foreign, we're having a transparency registry where, individuals who take money from foreign governments and then testify or engage in lobbying are going to have to go on a list and say effectively what they do. But in the sense of actually achieving results, we're going to have to see how this plays out in the next couple of years. And I do worry about vulnerable individuals in communities who feel like they can't enjoy the full rights of their being here, either as a permanent resident or Canadian citizen, because if they speak out, that they will suffer terrible consequences.
Yeah. So what about potential trade deals? How do they possibly affect our security if they're with China, if they're with India, if they're with the U.S.?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I'll put the U.S. in a separate category now. One of the things that's interesting is, again, and I said this earlier, I think China recognizes the situation that Canada's in, right? And is happy to put pressure on Canada as a result of that. We're seeing that right now. It's trying to put pressure on one sector to try and get relief in another sector. So Canada banned electric vehicles from China. And we can go into a whole discussion about why that is and what that is. I think the concern is that, again, China is able to effectively, give unlimited support to its industry to the point where if we allow China to flood Canada with Chinese-made electric vehicles, it would effectively end the electric vehicle manufacturing in Canada, right? And that is something that we don't want. I mean, the U.S. is putting enough pressure on us with regards to our auto industry that China is maybe trying to take up what's left, and we really don't want that to happen. But as a result of that, it has put pressure on canola. Right. In the canola farm. China will always go for canola. Yeah. One of the oldest tactics that China uses when we are negotiating is that right before the two sides meet, China will suddenly find something wrong with canola every time. Like, oh, there's fungus, or, oh, there's a labeling problem, or, suddenly we have to ban canola. And so when we go into these negotiations, China's trying to put us in a position where we have to give something up just to get back to the status quo. Yeah. And they do this constantly. Yeah. And I see that right now in our current dilemma, right? They want us to give up the EV ban in order for us to, and then they'll take the canola again. And my concern with that is that, it's a little bit like, I hope the audience knows what I'm talking about when I say like Lucy in the football, right? Like Lucy and Charlie Brown in the football. Like every time she's like, Lucy's like, I got the football right here. And she tries to convince Charlie Brown to run and kick the football. And every time she pulls the football away and Charlie Brown falls on his head every single time. And I feel like that we're doing the same thing. And, especially with canola is constantly the football. And, China, says, okay, well, we will relax the restrictions on canola, but you have to do these things for us. And they're effectively just they're not really giving anything up. They're doing what they can. They're just just putting that pressure on it. And I don't understand why we haven't recognized that and then tried to either diversify canola or figure out like some other alternative, because this isn't something that's going away. They will consistently, even if we did come to a trade agreement with China, and I'm not sure we will, or if we do, or how, but this is not something that's going to go away. They will consistently use this as a weapon to bludgeon us with so long as they can, from now until eternity. But then there's a question. I mean, Mary, and to your mind as a journalist, do you consider that a national security threat?
Well, it's tied to our economy. Why wouldn't it be?
Well, for a long time, we didn't consider the economy as something we wanted to securitize. The whole idea was that we got the government out of the economy. And now suddenly, we're sitting there, we're trying to have these conversations. Where does the economy actually, where does national security sit with the economy?
Well, because we need money for national security.
We need money.
And we have a bad economy. We don't have a good national security system.
And that's right. But I still think it's an uncomfortable conversation in Canada. We don't know where it is. This isn't a muscle that we have flexed for some time.
Well, how do you feel? What are your thoughts on that?
I think we need to do a better job educating our businesses and things like that about the national security threat. And then when we come under pressure, it's interesting to see, a lot of these lessons, I think, maybe get swept under the rug and people go, no, we have to fix this. We have to fix this. And, we have to learn to play the long game. So in some ways, I think it's also like that national security conversation comes with maybe a long-term strategy. And maybe this is something that Canada has missed. And it'll be interesting to see the extent to which the economy features in a national security strategy in Canada, which, has long been promised.
Okay, so sorry, are you saying then it should be part of the conversation? Do you feel there is a tie between the economy and national security, and that needs to be addressed?
It needs to be sorted. It needs to be sorted.
I know. What are you saying, Stephanie? What are you saying?
I'm being enigmatic, like a spy,
you are,
right?
Yeah.
Like a spy. No, okay, so let me put it to you this way. I think the way that we are seeing our national security agencies talk about this is the economic prosperity agenda. That if you listen to them, that's what they talk about. And as a result of this, what they are trying to say is, yes, we have a role here, but ultimately we can't, we don't have the final say intelligence is one piece of information in a larger puzzle that we have to think about. I don't want national security to be the only factor in decision making in Canada. We have to think about our human rights obligations. We have to think about goods and services. We have to be able, we're going to have to figure out how to do risk. And I think maybe when I say sort this out, what I mean is, what is Canada's threshold for risk? And I think that intelligence can play a role in informing those conversations about, okay, we want to, we're going to have to deal with China. It's too big of a country to ignore, but how do we do this in a way? Like, what is our risk threshold, and how does intelligence actually inform that understanding of the kind of risks that we can take? And that, I think, is the piece of the puzzle. So yes, national security is a part of that conversation, but it should not be the trump card in everything that we think about.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. I was thinking more, if you take this risk, let's just say with China, how does that then affect national security? Right. That's the way I was looking at it, rather than...
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. It's not a one and done, right? It's a constant piece of conversation that we need to be having with business, with government, but also Canadians, right? This is why I think the service director giving his speech was important. For us who study national security, there really wasn't a ton. There was a couple of really interesting statistics and things like that were mentioned, but by and large, we didn't learn that much. But what is important is that there's a new emphasis on transparency about these threats, because we can't have that conversation about risk, about what the role of security is in the economy, unless Canadians understand what's at stake, and unless there is that kind of what's often described as social license, right? The social license, the acceptance, yes, we are, working in the shadows. Yes, we are doing espionage, we're doing counterterrorism and counter espionage activities in Canada, but we're trying to do so within the law. And we're trying to do so in such a way that we're going to ensure your prosperity. And then Canadians, and trying to get Canadians to buy in on that. And I don't think they should do so uncritically. I think we need to have good and healthy conversations about this. But unless we have an ounce of transparency into what's actually happening, these larger conversations about national security aren't going to take place. And that, I think, hurts everybody.
Mm-hmm. So how good a job do you think CSIS and other agencies are doing with national security right now?
That's really hard. I feel like we can do a whole other podcast on, and just invite me back. I will talk to you about that for hours on end. Well, one of the things I do have some really strong concerns about the efficacy. Right. We have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years putting in legislation, some of it very controversial. Again, whole other episode. We can just make this a national security podcast, Mary. Like, honestly, I'm good for that.
I think there is one, but okay.
Yes, exactly. But that being said, we legislatively, I think a lot of the pieces are in place. There's more work that needs to be done, but can be done. The real issue is capacity to implement the change. And I'll give you an example. So this time last year, the RCMP was effectively saying, okay, we're going to work on foreign interference. We're doing all these things on foreign interference. Trump gets elected, 51st state rhetoric starts, and all of a sudden, all the RCMP people are taken off everything else and put on fentanyl. Right. And I feel like to a certain extent, national security in this country can be chasing the soccer ball around, like watching a little kid's game where they're chasing the soccer ball, right? Ooh, it's a new soccer ball, it's fentanyl. And now that's where the RCMP is, right? There's huge.
So are you saying too reactive?
It's reactive, but also that's partially because a lack of capacity. That there isn't this. And I don't necessarily think that means just throwing money at the problem. I think that there is a real issue here that the way it works is that CSIS collects intelligence, but the RCMP collects the evidence. They actually do the criminal prosecutions. And one of the things with the criminal prosecutions is they're very much, led by the RCMP, but the people who do those investigations are, they're not necessarily specialists in national security. The way it works is, you could be on provincial policing, you could be working in rural Saskatchewan, and then the next week, suddenly you're put on a sanctions case involving Russian businesses trying to get parts for drones, and you're not given any training for that. Right. And we have had real difficulties prosecuting national security offenses in this country as a result. Many espionage cases have fallen apart because we don't seem to have the expertise. And I do worry that our current models of the way we actually do national security investigations, but more importantly, national security enforcement, are not there. So, yeah, I mean, they could be great at collecting the information, but I do worry that, we don't hear a lot about prosecutions in this space. And the prosecutions we hear of often fall apart. They often fail. So what I worry about is our ability to actually act on the information that we have. And I do believe that we are in need to reform to a very large extent the RCMP, or at least the way we do national security policing in this country. I think that is the large gap that we have. That an institution that was built in the 19th century to effectively colonize the country is not the institution that we need to fight networks of violent extremist states and cartels engaging in malicious behavior towards our country, not to mention the cyber threats.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. That's a whole other conversation. I wouldn't mind touching on that. But let me just ask you this then. I mean, you say we don't have the capacity. Do we actually need an agency like a CIA or an MI6? We don't have that, right? We don't have it.
You're right. So that's actually something that makes us very different from our from other countries, and that includes our Five Eyes partners. Now, the Five Eyes is, of course, a network. It's
maybe you should explain that, right?
Yeah, so it's the United States, the United Kingdom, the Australia, New Zealand, and us, and it kind of formed in the Second World War, and ever since we have a very, very tight knit intelligence sharing operation. All of the four other agencies collect human intelligence in some way. So the United States famously has, of course, the CIA. It's interestingly enough, they don't have an internal they don't have a CSIS. If you think of the UK,
don't have a CSIS.
They don't have a CSIS. It's the FBI.
I didn't know that. Okay,
it's like the RCMP. Yeah, so they don't have a CSIS. They just have they have a CIA and they have an FBI. And in the UK, they have like a national police force, but they also have an MI5 and MI6.
Right.
Right. So they kind of have the whole thing. In Australia, they do. They have kind of the equivalent of a domestic and an international. And New Zealand, they've combined it into one agency. So we don't have that MI6 component. I don't like the CIA comparison because the CIA is pretty. A lot more kinetic than I think. It's not just.
So what are we doing in that
agency.
then? Like what are we contributing if we don't have that organization?
Where our powerhouse is on signals intelligence. So the communication security establishment, they are mandated to collect foreign intelligence outside of Canada. They can't collect information on Canadians, but they can collect foreign intelligence on pretty much anything else that's outside of the country. We are great at it. We are. I think it's actually underappreciated just how good we are. The Intelligence Select Committee in the UK, which is one of their intelligence review bodies, ranked it as one of the top 3 in the world, which people don't appreciate.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, it's really we're really good at it. Yeah, I mean, but even if we're like top 5, like that's great. So that's one of our major contributions.
So why did the US then? Didn't they want to kick us out?
Some in the United States wanted to kick us out.
Yeah, why?
Vibes. I'm going to go with vibes. It was kind of a whole anti-Canada movement. To be fair, like they say we have been free riding to a large extent. I think that's true. We do not collect, what the US really loves is granular information, granular kind of human intelligence, information, which we don't really have. We do really good kind of large strategic pieces. We do really good at at signals intelligence. We kind of lack that foreign human intelligence piece. Okay. So there has been some discussion about whether or not we do need something like this. I mean, I myself take the position that yes, we need some kind of foreign human intelligence capability, whether or not it is within the service as it exists now, whether or not it's a standalone agency. Myself and some colleagues are trying to do some work on this right now. And we'll see how this goes. But it's also expensive and hard and risky. And these are all three things that are anathema to Canada, right? So I think as a result of that, it's complicated, it's expensive, there's a huge risk to it. That's at a time when we're just trying to figure out our trade situation. It may not be the top of mind idea for government, but I do believe it is something that we are going to have because even if the United States continues to share intelligence with us, and by all accounts, they are continuing to do so, everything's okay. But the intelligence community down there is increasingly politicized. And it's not clear to me, I mean, and a lot of the people are being taken away from areas like foreign interference, cyber, cyber, like disinformation, cyberspace, stuff like that. And they're being put on things like tracking down migrants. And as a result of that, there may be less intelligence to be shared with us. That intelligence may reflect Trumpian worldviews increasingly. I can't say, I mean, obviously I haven't seen this, but these are the concerns that I have, right? That, intelligence services aren't going to be wanting to share a lot of information that contradicts the president's worldview because he is a very vindictive president. And this is something I worry about. So this is something we need to be more sovereign in our ability to do this. I don't want to create a Canadian CIA. It's not what we need, but do we need to be more sovereign in our ability to collect and analyze information? Maybe not so much because, CSIS is really good at covering threats to the security of Canada. Where I think it struggles is outside of that mandate. It becomes a little bit more challenging. Now, they take a very wide view of what constitutes a threat to security of Canada, and they'll say economic prosperity, threats to that prosperity is a threat. But at some point, if you are looking for information about trade and things like this, things that aren't necessarily part of violent extremism, espionage, foreign interference, then maybe we may need a discussion about either expanding that mandate or creating an agency that can actually collect that kind of activity.
So I'm glad because you sort of looped back to the U.S. because we didn't address it. We said, we'll tackle the U.S. separately.
We'll just pin that.
Yeah. So what do you think then? I mean, okay, sure, with trade, we're trying to cobble out trade with the U.S. With our current relationship, how much of a concern or a threat is that to our national security?
I mean, obviously, if the country can't afford to build out the kind of national security institutions that we need, then it's very bad. And so our prosperity is part of our national security. I think that's a reasonable argument to make. And now, to the extent, does that mean CSIS does trade negotiations? No. But, we have to think of the fallout of a poor economy, people being upset, people losing their jobs, and that those create risks in and of themselves. We have seen in recent years, for example, an increase in ideologically motivated violent extremism in this country. We are seeing right now an incredible backlash against immigration coming from violent, these kind of movements. A lot of these actors are now pushing for something they called remigration, which is basically it's just kind of returns immigration, like basically forcing people back to countries they feel like they originally came from, even if they were born here. These are real movements, and a lot of that's coming from the rhetoric that we see in the United States. So I guess I worry less about, there's obviously the economic impact, but there's also the social impact of what is coming out of the Trump administration. The kind of legitimizing discourses around topics like anti-LGBTQIA, or I should say 2S LGBTQI ideas. We've seen a huge surge in popularity for those ideas. Attacks on new Canadians, visitors here, South Asians in particular, has really skyrocketed. We've seen since 2022 a surge in misogynist content online as well. And so I think that, and obviously there's enough actors here in Canada that are willing to accept, promote, monetize that kind of content online. But there's no question that much of this surged when with the first Trump administration, and it's certainly back with the second Trump administration. And that's kind of how I look at the US right now, in terms of concerns about threats to national security.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was going to bring up we are a country that is rich in resources.
Yes.
Minerals, water. What about that too? That's very attractive to the US.
It is very attractive to the US. Now, right now, you have to wonder if this is part of the trade negotiations that are presently happening, right? A pipeline going south, and Trump wants oil. We can't give you oil. We can have this. You do wonder if that would be it. I'm not expecting the US to
invade.
No, I don't think so. I mean, right now, it doesn't seem likely. I mean, who knows? But it's just weird that we're even having these conversations. The thing I'm concerned with is that if the United States wants to, the amount of pressure it can put on our economy is effectively unlimited. And that can then force us into something like an economic union where the US effectively, it hasn't taken us over, but effectively dominates us to the point where it can leverage a lot of that control, right? Again, is that a foreign policy concern, a defense concern, a national security concern? I don't know, but it's not good. And what you want is your agencies to be focused on potential outcomes. But really what we need to do is kind of figure out how are we going to navigate the space if there is a deal, or if, a deal isn't coming and the pressures on our economy, really, really start to hurt. So yeah. I guess that's what I worry about, is kind of being forced into some kind of customs union where, yes, we still have our sovereignty in name, but economically we are effectively dominated almost entirely by the United States. To the extent that that's a CSIS problem, I don't know.
No, but isn't it interesting? We're back to the economy again. We're back to the economy.
Everything's economy.
Yeah. So, what? Okay. At this point, what would be your number one national security concern? I know there are many, but what would be at the top of your list?
Gosh, that's such a difficult question.
Like, let's say, this is something that really has to be addressed, like right now. Yes, there are, there's 2, 3, 4, and 5 priorities, but this one right now.
What's interesting is we are seeing the intelligence agencies and national security agencies in this country increasingly talk about polarization and the impact of polarization on violent extremism. We're seeing this in terms, like I said, I mentioned, the increase in violent rhetoric, if not attacks, against the 2S LGBTQI community, women, South Asians. Mm-hmm. We're seeing, obviously, concerns around what's happening again in the Middle East. That has created like terrible divisions, protests, all these kinds of things, and really divisive rhetoric online.
Yeah. And you know what? Can I just stop you? Because we didn't bring one thing up, which now when you say this, it makes me think of it. Polarization, not just of groups, but of isolated individuals. Because I think I actually read this in your book where you said it was these so-called lone actors that were actually responsible for a lot of the violent extremism that's going on in Canada.
Yes.
Is that still true?
Oh yeah, it is absolutely true. Or in small groups. It's funny, like to what extent is a lone actor really alone?
Yeah, I kind of, that's why I said so-called. I'm not, are they really alone? Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I know, because if they identify on online, one of the, getting back to this idea of the importance of our social fabric, and divisions and polarization and things like that. One of the real concerns that we have now is a group called 764, or the CRAM network. Which is this group of, there's no nice way of putting this, and I'll just warn listeners right now. It's effectively children torturing children. I don't know how else to say this, but basically it's a network of individuals who will go out and target children, try to be, pretend they're their friends, maybe buy them some presents online and things like that in a video game, and then eventually start to coerce them into providing, in some cases, nude photos, so child sexual abuse materials. In other cases, it's forcing them to engage in acts of violence against pets, against themselves, against others.
And these are
or
minors encouraging other minors.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically you're looking at like 13, 14-year-olds targeting like 6, 7, 8-year-olds, sometimes younger, forcing them to engage in criminal acts. And this is a real threat right now. And so this is, like I said, it's weird. These are online networks. So it's not like these people are sitting in the same room together or anything like that. These are online networks of people who are just out there to, and basically, force children to carve the name of their tormentors into their leg. It's it makes me physically nauseous to talk about these guys, if I'm perfectly honest with you. And there's been some good journalism that's out there that that has kind of talked about these things. Parents really need to be involved in this. So how do we think about that in terms of violent extremism and national security? Right. I mean, it's definitely something that is affecting the social fabric. It's definitely something that's divisive, and it takes advantage of people's, it takes advantage of children who are trying to figure out who they are, their need for connection, and then manipulating it against them in the worst possible ways. And so I think that, it's really terrible, some of the stuff that we're seeing out there right now. And, going back to the CSIS director speech, which I feel like we've done several times now. I mean, CSIS will be very happy with that. But going back to that, talking about the need for better interventions, better conversations about mental health. Some of the research I've been doing on these violent extremist movements, not 764 per se, but like other movements that are promoting misogynist narratives and things like this. Interestingly enough, a lot of these podcasters and things like this, they started off trying to be financial influencers, and then they couldn't make that work, and then they turned to misogyny, and that's how they gained their popularity. It's really weird. Like people are out there and they're desperate for attention in the economy, and they want to be influencers and things like that. And I think they realize that the more extreme that they are, a lot of times the more attention they get, the more money they get, the more clicks that they get when they do more and more outrageous things. And so, can you stop this by having better conversations about mental health, particularly men's mental health in a lot of ways, and boys' mental health? And, having spoken to social workers who are in these programs, a lot of these men are seeing, it's not just attacks on women. It's also telling young boys about how they should be living their lives, about what, you're 20 years, by the time you're 20, you should have a house and a car and paid off everything. And, be a crypto millionaire, and you should be swole and have like all these muscles and things like that. And, and they're saying they're getting texts from, 13, 14-year-old boys at night saying, why am I so ugly? Why aren't I better looking? And it's like, because you're 13 and going through puberty. Like there was a time where like we accepted that, but not social media makes that, this mirror that's held up to these children. And I think, and can lead them into these paths. So again, but I go back to you, Mary, and I say, to what extent can CSIS do anything about that?
I find that really, it's so interesting that we go from this high level security discussion about Canada. But then when I ask you, what's the one priority, you're talking about things that are so fundamental really to all of us, right? About good mental health, about close ties with other people, about feeling connected. Exactly.
Family.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it?
I think it does. And, yes, we can tie economically prosperous families are usually good families, right? Like, or are not going to, or they're facing different kinds of challenges at best, right?
Yeah,
like,
but at least they're able to eat. They've got a roof over their head, and, they can provide the basics. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's where that comes in. But to Dan Rogers' point, when he made his speech, is like, we actually need a lot more in mental health and counseling and prevention and these kinds of things. And I think that would go a long way. But we have to be an economically prosperous country in order for that to happen. So not to tie everything all together in a neat bow, but that's what I worry about at night is that kind of social cohesion is really the issue.
I got to ask, because so much, maybe too much. And I wonder about you, can you sleep at night?
Very well. Very well.
Oh, you do sleep very well.
Yeah.
Wow.
I just, I think you have to, this is the time of year where people watch sad movies or whatever. I'm like, nope, I'm watching the Hallmark Channel. I'm watching only the Hallmark Channel. I want to see the person move to a Christmas tree farm and get that. I also, it's important to have good friends, to have these conversations. It can get really bleak. But you have to find the other thing. The other thing I watch is it's like a HGTV or the Home Network or whatever it is, just because, at the end of every episode, someone gets a house.
Yeah.
It's a happy ending. So,
okay. So, I can end off with two kind of not national security questions per se. But first of all, why are you in this? Like, what drew you into this in the first place, this whole field?
I don't know. I've always been interested in international affairs. I was very lucky as, when I was a teenager, my parents sent me to something called Forum for Young Canadians, where I learned a lot about Parliament in Ottawa, and I was really interested, and I loved that. And then I went to kind of the equivalent there was something called the presidential. I'm trying to remember what it is, but there was something like the American equivalent in Washington the same year or the following year, and just learning about international institutions. And I just took this, and I just loved it in university, and I just kept going. And I was lucky enough to study abroad and to do these things. Why national security? I don't know. In 2005, I lived in the UK in downtown London, and there was a terrorist attack on July 7th, and someone in my residence was killed in that attack. Mm. And that really kind of interested me in national security. Not like it was it was just awful experience. And, to see your own neighborhood under attack and things like that. It does have an impact, but then also the idea of how democracies cope with emergencies and what are the limits of that, I think is really important. It can take you to some pretty dark places. And, there are times where I've had to question my own biases as a result of that. And people have pushed back on me pretty hard for some of the things I've said or done. And I think I try to take that very seriously and remember, there are people at the end of these policies. And I do try to remember that now more than ever. As the government is pushing ahead with controversial border legislation, national security legislation. It's important to have these conversations, but we can't have those unless we have a good understanding of what the actual threat is and what are the reasonable steps that we should be taking within the bounds of our Constitution to address it appropriately.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know, I was also wondering for you, just for you personally, what is that one thing here in this country worth saving? What is the one thing in Canada? The people.
Oh, us. Yeah. I mean, we have to do for the people. If you're not doing for Canadians, then what else are you doing it for? If we're not thinking about, okay, how is this helping to make Canada a better place? How is this, ensuring, that, that the Canadians can live the best lives that they can, free from interference, free from fear, getting back to that almost like, Rooseveltian kind of language, I think, FDR kind of language, but like, that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that Canadians are living, good, healthy, prosperous lives that are free from fear and intimidation as to the best extent possible. Now, what we've learned and what I hope Canadians are learning is for a long time, we thought we don't have to worry about what happens outside of our borders. You come to Canada to be safe.
Yeah.
But the threats go beyond the borders. It concerns me very much that in the budget, they cut foreign affairs, that they cut international development, because international, if a pandemic starts, that's and by easily preventable diseases, because, Western countries decided to cut all their funding for diseases, that's really bad. And so it's like Canadians have to appreciate that these threats don't start and end in Canada, that they do start internationally, that there is this, we talked about the transnational links at the beginning of this podcast. And, so that requires us to be abroad, to think about national security issues, but we should also be doing it in a way that, I guess the way I like to think about it, and when I wrote that, when I published that book in 2021, my thesis was that we want to educate not so Canadians are afraid, but so they have empathy with others, with each other. And if we can frame our national security through that prism of empathy, rather than just being afraid of everything all the time, and maybe this is why I go to bed at night and sleep, but if we can kind of take that more empathetic approach and try to view these through the eyes of the people who are most affected by them, then I think we're going to be far off. We're going to be a lot better off as a country.
I'm going to end it off on that. Great words. And I loved your book. You know what? I think your book should be required Is it required reading for a course? By the way,
I try not. I have a couple chapters here or there and everywhere, but I always make sure I offer other views as well, because I think the worst thing you can do as a professor is make the kids buy your own book.
Well, it's a good explainer. No,
it's in libraries. You can read it in the libraries.
Okay, fine.
I appreciate that.
This was a great discussion. Really appreciate you coming on.
I am so happy to be here. And thank you so much for your thoughtful questions, making me think, pressing me on ideas like why is something a national security issue? Why isn't it? And I hope we can have conversations in the future.
I hope so. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Thank you.
That is Stephanie Carvin. She is an associate professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Relations at Carleton University. She's also the author of Stand on Guard, Reassessing Threats to Canada's National Security. That was nominated for the Donner Prize. She's also a co-host of the podcast Secure Line, which explores Canada's security and intelligence landscape. You can check those out. We will have links to her work in our show notes. That is it for our show today. We hope you enjoyed it. Please follow us on social. Our handle is @CRAM Ideas. See you back here next time.